Thanks everyone. So it's such a pleasure to introduce our interviewer today, Chris Cooper, and our guest presenter, Brian Gorman. Chris.
Yeah. Thanks, Tim. So the call scheduled for tonight was originally going to be a preview of all the sessions that we were going to be delivering, with all of the presenters here giving a preview of what we're going to deliver. And obviously, with things having changed, we wanted to do something different. And it was actually an idea of Patrick Bowes originally, who unfortunately can't make it tonight, that we ought to do something tonight, recognising that people within our community will be having similar concerns at this time. And it would be great to be able to deliver a call tonight whereby we can all share how things are for us, and also provide some suggestions, some guidance, some support, or just a listening ear on what we can do to support each other during this time. And so from that, with the absolute obvious choice of a person to reach out to deliver a session was Brian Gorman. And I'm really pleased at the session he's going to deliver for us tonight. So he's going to deliver a version of a workshop he's delivering across the internet and for many different companies at the moment, called Adjusting Anchors. And Brian's delivered this program to over 150 people, ranging from one-to-one clients to a group of 50 HR professionals, coaches and consultants. And he's also working with an international animal rights organisation to deliver it to over 100 of their employees. It offers participants the opportunity to regain a sense of stability and control in the midst of uncertainty that the pandemic has caused for us all. So I'm going to hand over now to Brian.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone. I think this picture represents how most of us, to some degree or another, and clients and family and friends and colleagues have felt over the last month. Sort of adrift, if you will, a little bit. We even heard some of that in people checking in. Pushed around and pulled around by what's happening around us. And so this workshop is one that is about helping regain some control, regaining some stability. I'm taking you through the individual version of this workshop. I will be putting in the chat a guide and a template that is for individuals, that you can use for yourself, that you can also use with your family and loved ones and friends. I'm also going to, at the end of the workshop, talk about how you translate, if you will, what I'm presenting to an organizational application, and I'll be putting that template and guide in the chat as well. I want to start with Superstorm Sandy. I live in Hoboken, New Jersey. We are right across the Hudson River from Manhattan. Our average elevation is 7 feet above sea level. The statistics, if you will, about Superstorm Sandy are on the left-hand side. The right-hand side gives you a little bit of what the experience was like here in October, November of 2012. If you look at the far left, the upper left corner of the photograph, that little white area behind the bushes and to the left of the telephone pole is the front door of my apartment building. We're fortunate because our first floor is about 3 feet above the street level. Not everybody was so fortunate. This is looking out my window the morning after Superstorm Sandy came through. You can see the water is already starting to recede, and you can also see that some people's homes were significantly flooded. I have a friend who lives about 4 blocks from here who woke up floating on his mattress in the middle of the night. What happened is again, we're about 7 foot on average above sea level. At the north end and the south end of the city are inlets to the Hudson River. It was a super high tide, and then the storm surge and the water just flooded in. We were without electricity for over a week, without heat for longer, without phone service, without cell service. It felt like, in some ways, the early days of the coronavirus pandemic. It felt like the world was turned upside down. When I got out and started walking around the city, there was damage and destruction everywhere. I think some of the more difficult things were walking past homes and apartment buildings where there were toys and children's high chairs and cribs and so forth out on the curb. But also then walking past the homeless shelter, which is in the basement of a church about 5 blocks from me. And they were flooded, and donations to the homeless shelter had to be thrown away. When I got to the north end of the city, I saw this. This sailboat, like many others, was anchored in the inlet about, and now it's resting on the sidewalk about 5 miles, or I'm sorry, about a half a mile from where it was. It's still attached to the buoy, which is still attached to the anchor, but the anchor wasn't strong enough to hold it in the turbulence. When I got to the inlet, there were a number of sailboats just like this. The anchor was strong enough. The rope between the anchor and the boat was strong enough, but no adjustment, or not enough adjustment, had been made. And the boat sank. And then there were sailboats that were just bouncing away, happily, sitting there on the water as if nothing had happened. And at the time, it really got me to thinking that I have a lot of anchors in my life that hadn't changed. My apartment was still here. Yes, I'd lost heat and electricity, but all of those things that I cherish in my apartment are still here. My son was still here. Part of this work that, and we're actually going to begin to experience it in breakout groups in a few minutes. Part of the value of this work is it helps people reconnect, bring their anchors up above the surface to see what they are, and realize that in many cases, they still have those anchors that they can count on. At the individual level, we talk about anchors, and in a minute I'll show you a slide with some examples of each of these. But people, beliefs, traditions, things, ways of doing, and ways of being. So ways of doing are really our muscle memory. And ways of being are really our neural networks. And I want to give you one example of a way of doing that I thought was just so brilliant that came up in one of the workshops, and in a way it's so funny. This guy in one of the workshops that I did last week said, for 25 years, I got up every day, I put my suit on, I got on the subway in Brooklyn, I went into my job at in Manhattan. I came home at the end of the day and I took my suit off. Said for the first 2 weeks, I got up in the morning, I went into my home office, and I was totally lost. And then one day I got up, I put my suit on, I went into my home office, and things started to feel a little bit okay. So now every day I get up, I put my suit on before I go into my home office. And I've added another twist to it. Before I leave my home office to go back to the bedroom and change into my casual clothes, I text my wife to tell her I'm coming home. So here are some examples. I'm not going to read them, but just take a minute to look at this. The templates that you get will actually have examples in them and will for each of the categories. So as I was doing this research, I learned something else. There are actually two different types of anchors that boats and ships use. There's the kind that's pictured here. It can take different shapes, different sizes. When I was a kid, we used to tie a rope around a rock and drop it off to the bottom of the stream when we're out in a rowboat. Those are the anchors that we think about when we hear the word anchor. But when you're here, you're out in the middle of the wide open seas. You can't drop an anchor to the bottom of the ocean. And so there's a different kind of anchor that they use. I have no idea of the physics of it, but it's called a sea anchor. And what it does is it keeps the ship facing into the turbulence so it doesn't go sideways and capsize. And in turbulent times like we're all living through, in what is really a global transformation, it's important to pay attention to sea anchors too. Those things that keep you facing into the turbulence so that you don't capsize. A little bit of neuroscience about this, and then we're going to jump into the work. The prefrontal cortex, from an evolutionary perspective, is the newest part of the brain. It's found in the front of our head. It's where empathy, judgment, creativity, problem solving, decision making, all of those kinds of activities that make us in some ways human, or not all, but many, exist in the prefrontal cortex. It takes 1/10 of a second to trigger the prefrontal cortex, and that sets up, in essence, turns on all of the electrochemical activity that allows that judgment, that decision-making, that creativity to happen. The amygdala, the primitive brain, sits at the back of the head. It's activated by fear. It's activated by feeling threatened. And when that happens, our fight, flight, freeze, appease response kicks in. The electrochemical activity in the brain functions for fight, flight, freeze, appease. And what it actually does is it limits or blocks access to the prefrontal cortex. This is triggered in 7/100ths of a second. So in 300ths of a second faster, what's known as amygdala hijack can take place. And quite frankly, when you're operating out of fear, you don't have access to acting rationally. One more piece, and some of you have heard this piece from me before, but it's important to repeat here. Neuroscience now tells us we actually have 3 fully functioning brains. There's the brain in the head, which is the cephalic brain, and we've talked about what that brain is good at. There's also a cardiac brain. It has the same sensory neurons, motor neurons. It collects data, analyzes data, stores data, retrieves data. It triggers the same kind of electrochemical activity as in the head. And the cardiac brain, the brain in the heart, is the seat of passion, compassion, and our values. And there's a gut brain, and the gut brain actually has about the same number of neurons as a cat's brain. It actually stretches, if you will, from the esophagus to the other end of the digestive tract. It is best at courage, It is best at self-protection, and it is best at, this is where who you are at your core resides. So if you think about it, what you are passionate about, your values, who you are at your core, some of these things are your sea anchors, and they're not up in your head. They're in your heart and they're in your gut. So it's important when you're doing this work, it's important when you're working with your clients, when you're figuring things out with those who are important in your life. It's important that you connect head, heart, and gut, that you bring them into alignment. And so I'm just literally going to talk you through what this is, because we don't have time to do it. But this exercise will bring the sympathetic nervous system, which is triggered by the fight, flight, freeze, appease, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which brings us back into calm. It will bring them into alignment, and that in turn brings head, heart, and gut into alignment. And you begin by simply holding your hands over your heart, and you breathe in and out to an even count. And the recommendation is an even 6 count in, 6 count out. And when you do this, it may take a little bit of time. Focus your attention on your breath going to your heart, and you'll actually feel your body sort of letting loose and beginning to calm down. From there, you move up to the head and do the same. Back to the heart, back to the gut, down to the gut, and back to the heart again. So I'm going to take questions in a few minutes, but just let me walk through this and a few examples. You don't need to write this down. Again, in the guide, it will take you through, and it asks individual questions around each of these steps, gives you guidance around each of these steps. So the first thing you need to do is create an inventory. What are your anchors? And they're very personal. Your anchor might be a pet. Someone else might not have a pet. A colleague of mine worked with someone whose anchor was his Ferrari. I don't even own a car. And if I did, it would just be a car. So anchors are very personal. Inventory your anchors. What are the sea anchors? The third step is to determine the adjustments that need to be made. Prioritize those. Because none of us can take on all of the change that we're facing right now. And again, we heard that with people's check-ins. Sometimes you just need to check out for a little bit. What are those adjustments that are essential? And then as coaches, we know our clients need to give themselves permission to make changes sometimes. What permission do you need to give yourself to make changes? So just a few quick examples, and then I'll take questions, then we're going to move into some breakout rooms and start actually doing a little bit of this work. I've been in this apartment since 2006. I love it. I'm sitting here. If I look sort of to the southeast, I see the World Trade Center. If I walk across the room and look to the northeast, I see the Empire State Building. I've got a wood-burning fireplace. I can see for miles. I have beautiful skylights. It's my nest. But I've never been forced to nest like I am now. And I'm sharing my nest full-time with my son, whom I've loved dearly. But he and I have never nested this much together either. So it's important to declutter the apartment. So we've begun to do that, letting go. But to do it, we had to give ourselves permission to let go of things that no longer have meaning to us. I have a client who's 10 years out of college. He and his fraternity brothers have still been going out drinking in New York City every Thursday night. It's the boys' night out, but the boys can't go out anymore. So they decided they're going to do a boys' night in. This has been an anchor for him since he was an undergraduate. But it's an anchor he's decided he has to let go of because it's more important for him to spend that time with his family than drinking online with his old fraternity brothers. So high-level change plan, he's going to call them because an email is not going to work. But he also feels a special connection to a few of them. So he's going to set up a different relationship. And finally, and I mentioned this in my checking in, I've made some adjustments to morning practice, which is a sea anchor for me. So at this point, Chris, do we have questions in the chat, or I'm open also to any other questions?
We've got no questions yet in the chat room. If anyone doesn't have any questions, we can take those now. Otherwise, Brian, you can continue.
Hi, this is Doug. Brian, I think the third line down on 2 slides before it said choices versus good ideas. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, not choices. I'm sorry. Let me go up. How did I do that? Essential adjustments over good ideas. So, you know, for me, it was more essential that I make an adjustment to my morning practice. It's a good idea to declutter the apartment. So make those adjustments that are critical first. Okay, we're going to send you into the breakouts. I'm going to come in and out, I think. We're going to see how this works. I've run the breakouts as the host, but I'm not the host today. We're going to send you into breakouts. Going to ask you, and Alan, if you could actually set the breakouts at about 8 minutes. Going to ask you to just begin to identify some of your anchors, and of those, any that are sea anchors. We're going to come out very quickly, check in, and then go back in for a few more minutes to do a little more work.
Here we are.
Okay, very quickly, any ahas? Insights? Anyone?
Mark here. I think the actual differentiation between a sea anchor and the traditional anchor was useful for me, and which ones really to pay more attention to and take care of.
Thank you. Other observations, questions, ahas? Bernie?
Yeah, so I was just had an awareness right in the last minute, I think, in the group. And that was that at this time, I'm feeling a need to be more connected with my gay tribe. I was sharing about how I'm in a local men's group, and which is mostly straight men, who I was meeting with in person, but now it's online. It's changed, and I'm not feeling like I want to be part of it. I'm back with my old group back in Connecticut. Now we're online, I can rejoin it, so I'm have to be part of that mostly gay group.
Other
Love that.
Other insights?
Yeah, I think Matt here. I think it's interesting that an anchor for me can be an inanimate object, which 3 months ago didn't have as much importance, like a phone, to also my mother, which has an insane amount of importance. So like 2 things that you think wouldn't even be on the same level of importance. If I didn't have my phone, I'd be going insane right now. So.
And part of what you're saying there, Matt, is really the whole, it's always been an anchor for you, but it's below the surface. It's not because it's there, it's convenient and so forth. You don't recognize that. And that's why it's so important to intentionally do this work so that you can say, oh, I'm spending this time with these guys I really don't want to spend time with right now. There's others that it's more important for me to connect to. Or, wow, I really need to focus my time with my mom more. I'm going to, when we don't have time, usually this is a 90-minute workshop all by itself. So we're going to just go back through and come on, let's move here. This is a screenshot of the individual anchors template. So again, it has instructions all the way through, who are the people in my life that provide me with a sense of stability and security, beliefs, traditions. It takes you through each step of the process. And then this is a screenshot of the individual template. It has the 3 examples that I talked through. It has each of the categories, and it has examples of the categories. They're Word documents so that you can edit them however it makes sense for you. You can add lines, you can delete lines, you can add categories if that's appropriate for you. This is an example, a screenshot of the organizational template. What's important, whether you're using the individual or the organizational, the big translation that you need to do is to remember that anchors are personal. So in the organization, let's take that as an example. There are going to be some things that are an anchor for one person on a team, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with it. People are going to have anchors outside of their team elsewhere in the organization. That's okay. And they're going to be anchors within teams, within departments or divisions or sales teams or whatever they are. What's important when they identify shared anchors is that they work together to identify what adjustments need to be made and how to make them. That shared decision-making is an important part of the process. So that's it, folks. Questions?
That was great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question, Brian.
Yes.
I'm not 100% sure whether you do this always at a time of change, for example, in an organization, or whether this is something that is useful in a business as usual scenario.
I actually encourage it in a business as usual scenario as well, just because it brings up those common anchors, if you will, and those differences. And in doing that, it allows people to look at, maybe we should make this one tighter. Maybe we should let go of this. I'm actually working on how do you now apply this to moving an organizational culture from in-person to virtual, or to a blend of in-person and virtual. because those cultural elements, how we show up at work, and what we do at work, those cultural elements are pretty strong anchors for people.
I have a quick question. You often make a point about head, heart, and gut. And I was wondering, do all three of those have maybe specific anchors? Or is it always a combination of all three? Or do you get led by one anchor that's more is heart-centric or one that's more gut-centric?
I think, Tom, the answer to your last question is it depends on the person. But clearly, for me, what I'm passionate about, who I'm passionate about, what my values are, my heart-centered anchors are strong. Who I am at my core, a number of people have talked about who you are at your core, that you're now giving service where before you were charging for your coaching. You know, as Chris said, I'm giving this workshop in every venue that I can, because that's part of who I am at my core. That's a sea anchor. That's not something I'm going to let go of.
Great, thank you.
Okay, the templates are in and the chat, and I thank you all.